Something just shifted in the atmosphere over North America. And you need to understand this before you make a single plan for the days ahead, because the story most people are telling right now is wrong. You've probably heard that relief is coming, that the heat is finally breaking, that a cool front is going to sweep in and rescue you from this brutal summer, and that's partly true. But the newest data tells a much harder story than that. The cool air so many of you have been praying for is not going to reach nearly as far as everyone hoped. And behind it, the heat is loading up to come roaring back with a fury we haven't seen yet this entire season. On top of that, the Pacific is spinning up another dangerous system aimed toward Hawaii, an island chain that is still catching its breath from the last one. This week just turned genuinely serious. So let's go through every piece of this: the storms today, the tropical threat, and the heat that's about to become the real headline. All of it laid out straight, the good and the bad. Before we talk about next week, we have to deal with today. Over the last day, rounds of storms rolled through parts of the country and left a mess behind them. Wind damage and strong gusts tore across sections of the upper Midwest, and more storms lit up across the southeast. The aftermath is still with us this morning. Right now, there are well over 180,000 homes and businesses sitting in the dark across the country. The hardest hit areas are still struggling to recover, with tens of thousands without power across the Midwest, and even parts of Hawaii still dealing with outages from the tropical system that already slammed into them. That's the backdrop we're walking into today. A country already bruised from the last round, bracing for the next. The main threat today is wind. Damaging straight-line winds are the headline. The kind of gusts that snap branches, topple weakened trees, and knock the power right back out in places that just got it restored. There's also a narrow tornado threat today, and it's worth being precise about this rather than scaring everyone in the country. The one area where a tornado is genuinely believable is the corridor running from Missouri down toward Tennessee and Kentucky. Everywhere else on the map, the ingredients don't come together for a real tornado risk today. So if you're in that Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky zone, that's where you keep your guard up the most. Here's how the day plays out hour by hour. Early on, storms fire across the eastern plains, over parts of Nebraska and South Dakota, rolling through the morning and into the midday hours. As the afternoon heats up, a second area of storms bubbles up out west across the Four Corners, catching parts of Arizona, Colorado, and northern New Mexico. But the system to really watch is the one sliding across southern Iowa into Missouri and pushing toward Illinois and Indiana. That's the one carrying the tornado potential later this evening, specifically for southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, and western Kentucky. As night falls, those storms are expected to gather into a cluster, and once they do, the threat shifts more toward heavy rainfall and damaging winds rather than tornadoes. But earlier in that window, there's a real chance for a few strong supercells, the rotating storms that can briefly spin up something dangerous. Here's what makes today's setup interesting from a forecasting standpoint, and it's worth understanding because it tells you where the real risk lives. Up across northern Missouri, the winds high up in the atmosphere are weak. When the winds aloft are weak, storms tend to be more of a wind and rain threat rather than a tornado threat, because you need that change in wind speed and direction with height to get storms rotating. But slide south, over southern Missouri, southern Illinois, and into the western Tennessee and Kentucky Valley, and those upper-level winds crank up dramatically. That's exactly why the tornado threat concentrates there and not farther north. Those stronger winds aloft give the storms the twist they need, and combined with the instability, the fuel in the atmosphere that thunderstorms feed on, those cells can hold together and stay dangerous well into the overnight and early morning hours. That overnight timing is its own concern because storms that hit while people are asleep are the ones that catch folks off guard. Overnight storms carry across the Ohio Valley. By the afternoon, everything reorganizes toward the northeast. This is where the threat could actually get bumped up because a line of storms looks capable of producing straight-line wind damage with gusts potentially reaching 50 to 60 mph. It could stretch a long way, from Long Island all the way down across the Delmarva Peninsula, pulling in Delaware, New Jersey, and eastern Pennsylvania, down through Virginia and across the mid-Atlantic. Tomorrow doesn't look like a tornado day. It looks like a wind day, plain and simple, but a wind day that a lot of densely populated areas in the Northeast need to take seriously. If you live anywhere from Virginia up through the New York City area, keep an eye on the sky tomorrow afternoon and evening. Now let's turn to the tropics, because there are two very different stories playing out in two different oceans, and you need to understand both. Start with the Pacific, because that's where the immediate danger is. There's a system spinning up out there, and the forecast models are giving it a very high chance of developing into a tropical depression, and then strengthening over the coming days as it tracks westward to west-northwestward at around 10 to 15 mph. Here's the concerning part. The intensity guidance suggests this system has the potential to strengthen quickly. potentially climbing from a tropical storm up toward hurricane strength in a short window of time. The setup in the atmosphere shows a strong dome of high pressure that's going to steer this thing on a westward push. Depending on exactly how the track evolves, it could pass uncomfortably close to Hawaii within roughly 5 days. Hawaii has already been through it recently. The islands were just hit by a tropical system, so people there are already exhausted, already cleaning up. The good news, if there is any, is that the average of the model guidance keeps the center of this new system somewhat away from a direct island strike. But, and this is critical, impacts reach far beyond the center of any tropical system. Even a track that stays offshore can hammer the islands with heavy rain and strong winds. Some guidance points toward gusts in the 40 to 50 mph range, mainly focused on the Big Island, with the possibility of stronger winds spreading to other islands if the system tracks a bit closer or comes in stronger than the calmer scenarios suggest. The rain is what matters most here. On an island chain, heavy tropical rainfall is genuinely dangerous because the steep terrain funnels water into fast, violent flooding and mudslides. Some of the guidance points toward the possibility of another 7 to 8 inches of rain for the Big Island, with heavy rain for the other islands as well. The weather model solutions bring even more tropical moisture and heavier impacts than that. So to everyone in Hawaii watching this isn't a call to panic, but it is a call to pay very close attention over the next few days and to listen to local officials, because it genuinely looks like another system could be heading your way. And you know better than anyone how fast conditions can turn on the islands. Now cross over to the Atlantic, because this is where the story flips completely, and it's actually reassuring. As things stand, the National Hurricane Center is not flagging anything in the Atlantic over the next 7 days. Nothing. And this has been the theme of the entire hurricane season. Here's why. Normally, as we push into September, the peak of the season, we start seeing big high-pressure systems set up near Bermuda that steer tropical systems around and sometimes toward land. That's always the region to watch. But this year, the atmosphere has been actively hostile to Atlantic development. The reason comes down to one enormous force out in the Pacific, a strengthening El Niño. Not just any El Niño, forecasters now put the odds at greater than 90% that this becomes a very strong event heading into the fall. A powerful El Niño is essentially poison for Atlantic hurricanes. It cranks up the wind shear across the tropical Atlantic. Wind shear being when winds blow at different speeds and directions at different heights. For a young tropical system trying to organize, that shear is brutal. It tilts the storm over, rips apart the tall thunderstorms it needs to survive, and shreds it before it can ever get going. Layer on top of that a persistent blanket of dry, dusty Saharan air drifting across the Atlantic, and you have a 1-2 punch that has kept a lid on this basin all season long. Tropical systems need warm, moist air to breathe, and that dry desert air chokes them out. So when you look at the model guidance for the Atlantic, you have to read it carefully, because this is exactly where people get scared for no reason. Every single day, some model run will show a storm popping up somewhere out there, often near the Leeward Islands or the Lesser Antilles. But you have to look at whether that solution is actually trending and whether the ensemble members agree. Right now, when you dig into the ensembles, only a small fraction show any real chance of even a weak tropical depression. The rest show the dry air simply overwhelming anything that tries to form. Any tropical wave that does roll off is more likely to just bring a surge of moisture rather than a genuine organized threat. And even in the scenarios where something does manage to hang together, the pattern is set up to sweep it around the high pressure and curve it out to sea harmlessly, what forecasters casually call a fish storm, because it only threatens the open ocean and the fish. This is backed up by the deeper atmospheric signals too. The guidance covering the main development region, the stretch of the tropical Atlantic where the big storms are born, points toward mostly unfavorable conditions, not just through the rest of August, but continuing through September and even into October. That's completely normal for a strong El Niño year. There may be some back and forth, some brief windows where things look a little less hostile as we get into early September, but the overall theme holds. The energy, the lift, the storm activity all stays concentrated in the Pacific, which is exactly why Hawaii keeps getting targeted while the Atlantic stays quiet. The main thing to watch in the Atlantic isn't the deep tropics, but the possibility of a front-driven system closer to home, something that could develop near the Gulf or along the East Coast later on. That's been the pattern all season, and it's expected to continue. With the storms and the tropics covered, here's what's genuinely the biggest story of this whole forecast. The part that's going to affect the most people, and the part where the newest data took a turn for the worse, the weather pattern itself. Yes, there's still a cool front coming through this week, and for folks in the north, it's genuinely pleasant. But here's the catch that keeps tripping people up. That cooler air is reinforced by heat every single day, so the relief is more of a flicker than a flood. Next week brings a stronger cool front. That one you'll actually feel a real noticeable drop. But right as we cross the very end of August into September, that cool air pulls out and we go through another sharp pattern change. And this one swings the door wide open for heat to come flooding back. Here's the machinery behind this, and it's actually straightforward once you see it. Forecasters watch a few key signals to know what the atmosphere is about to do. One of them measures the setup over the eastern Pacific near Alaska. When it tips negative, it builds a ridge of high pressure in the west and digs a cooler trough across the central and eastern United States. That's what delivers the cool front. The newest data does show that dip coming for next week. That's the relief you've been promised. But watch how fast the models yank that signal right back toward neutral and even positive shortly afterward. That flip is the heat coming back. The same story shows up in the signal over the North Atlantic near Greenland, the one that can bring cold air plunging south. Just yesterday, the data was pointing toward a rare, strong, cold blocking pattern. But now the models bring that pattern in and then whisk it away just as quickly. So the cold shot is real, but it's brief. Here's where the data gets specifically concerning. There's a well-known tendency for the American forecast model, the GFS, to be too aggressive, to drag cool anomalies too far south and too deep. On the newest runs, that same model is not only failing to push the cool air deep this time, it's actually building the heat stronger than expected. Picture the map by the end of next week. That aggressive model shows a big heat pocket ballooning from the south all the way up into Canada and stretching back across the southwest, with the cool relief confined to only the northern tier. Now, the more consistently accurate European model, the ECMWF, doesn't buy that extreme northward surge of heat. It keeps things more measured, a nice cool front for the north, but not the scorcher everywhere solution. So the truth is probably somewhere in between. But the fact that the heat is showing up stronger than forecast on multiple looks is the warning sign that the second half of this story is about heat, not relief. This is confirmed when you look at the official outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. Their guidance for the coming week to 10 days does show that cooler jet stream dipping through, but it does not carry that cool air far to the south at all. Instead, there's a big above-average heat signal locking in across a huge swath of the country, stretching from Montana down through Texas and Louisiana. And the extreme heat outlook is even more pointed. There's a high risk of dangerous heat building for the window around the 26th through the 28th, centered on New Mexico, Texas, and pushing into Kansas, Oklahoma, and western Arkansas, possibly lingering into Louisiana. A broader moderate risk zone stretches all the way from Louisiana across to Arizona. But here's the thing you can't lose sight of. You do not have to wait until next week for dangerous heat, because what you're dealing with this very week is shaping up to be some of the hottest weather of the entire year. The National Weather Service is warning that many areas could see their hottest temperatures so far in 2026, or even the hottest in several years. The specific strategy required every existing clone manufacturer, companies like Compaq, Dell, and Hewlett-Packard, to agree to pay IBM ongoing licensing fees, specifically to keep building compatible machines, and in one of the single most consequential acts of collective corporate defiance in the entire history of the technology industry, the clone. Manufacturers, led specifically by Compaq's own chief executive Rod Canyon, simply refused. Rather than paying IBM's licensing fees, this coalition of manufacturers instead chose to continue developing and improving the existing older open architecture standard entirely independently, working directly and increasingly closely with Intel and Microsoft instead, effectively building an entire parallel computing ecosystem that IBM itself no longer had any meaningful control over whatsoever. IBM's gamble on MCA and OS2 ultimately failed completely. Faced with the clone manufacturer's unified refusal to cooperate, IBM was eventually forced to quietly abandon microchannel architecture entirely. And Microsoft, watching IBM's own proprietary PS2 and OS2 initiatives struggle badly against the continued runaway success of the older, openly licensed standard, made its own increasingly decisive strategic pivot, redirecting its primary development energy away from the jointly developed OS2 project and toward its own independently owned operating system, an increasingly successful graphical product called Windows. When Windows 3.0 launched in 1990, it proved to be a genuine, massive commercial success, definitively completing Microsoft's own transformation from a comparatively small software supplier IBM had once treated as a minor subcontractor into the single most powerful, most consequential company in the entire personal computing industry, permanently eclipsing IBM's own influence over the exact hardware standard bearing IBM's own original name. It's genuinely worth pausing here to appreciate the full, almost dizzying scale of this specific reversal of fortune. IBM had entered the personal computer market from a position of nearly total institutional dominance, commanding vast financial resources, an internationally trusted brand name, and decades of accumulated relationships with major corporate customers that no startup competitor could realistically hope to match. And yet, within roughly a single decade, the company found itself reduced to just one competitor among dozens selling machines built around a standard IBM itself had originally created, while the two companies that had originally served as comparatively minor outside suppliers for that very first 1981 machine, Intel and Microsoft, went on to become two of the most valuable, most powerful technology companies in the entire history of the industry. An outcome so thoroughly permanently associated with those two specific companies, working in tandem, that the entire era of computing history would eventually come to be known throughout the industry using a single telling portmanteau, Wintel, a name that pointedly excludes IBM entirely, despite the fact that IBM had built the very first machine the entire standard was originally based upon. IBM's broader corporate struggles throughout this same period extended well beyond simply losing control of the personal computer market. And by 1993, the cumulative damage had become genuinely severe, with the company posting a staggering $8.1 billion net loss for that single year alone at the time. Among the largest annual corporate losses in American business history, driven by a combination of the collapsing PC business, a broader industry-wide shift away from expensive mainframe computing, and a famously slow, bureaucratic internal corporate culture that had struggled badly to adapt to an industry now moving at a dramatically faster competitive pace than anything IBM's own decades-old internal processes had ever been designed to handle. That specific financial crisis ultimately forced a genuinely dramatic corporate transformation under new chief executive Louis Gerstner, who made the consequential decision to reposition IBM away from primarily manufacturing hardware and toward a considerably more services and software-oriented business model, a strategic pivot that would eventually gradually restore the company's financial health over the following decade, even as its own personal computer division continued struggling against relentless price competition throughout that same period. The final, genuinely symbolic conclusion to this entire multi-decade saga arrived in 2005, when IBM formally sold its personal computer division, the exact same business unit that had once launched the machine that gave an entire industry its name, to the Chinese manufacturer Lenovo, permanently ending IBM's direct involvement in a product category it had personally, if somewhat accidentally, created 24 years earlier. It's also worth noting a genuinely striking counterfactual that historians and technology writers have specifically enjoyed exploring in the decades since, because the entire trajectory of modern computing might have unfolded in a genuinely unrecognizable form had just one or two of IBM's original 1980 and 1981 decisions gone differently. Had IBM insisted on an exclusive licensing arrangement with Microsoft, or had the company chosen to design and manufacture its own proprietary processor, rather than sourcing one from Intel, the entire subsequent clone industry that eventually produced Compaq, Dell, and dozens of other major computing companies might simply never have existed in anything resembling its actual historical form. Some technology historians have specifically speculated that a more tightly controlled, more traditionally IBM-style approach to the original PC might have kept the company dominant for a considerably longer period, but would very likely have also meaningfully slowed the overall pace of the personal computer's spread throughout the broader economy, since the specific open architecture that eventually cost IBM its own market leadership was simultaneously the exact same feature that allowed prices to fall so rapidly and competition to flourish so vigorously throughout the entire following decade. In that specific sense, the very same decisions that ultimately cost IBM control over its own creation may have simultaneously been responsible for making the personal computer revolution happen considerably faster and considerably more affordably for tens of millions of ordinary consumers and businesses than a more tightly controlled, more proprietary IBM approach would likely have ever allowed. Looking back across the complete arc of this story, from Herman Hollerith's original punch card tabulators counting Americans during the 1890 census, through Thomas Watson's construction of the most dominant, most feared business machine company on the entire planet, through the System 360's audacious billion-dollar gamble that cemented decades of mainframe supremacy, and finally through the specific, genuinely instructive chain of decisions. An open architecture built for speed rather than long-term control, a non-exclusive software licensing deal that let a small Seattle company become the industry's true kingmaker, and a failed proprietary counterattack that united IBM's own former partners directly against it, that handed an entire industry to companies IBM itself had once treated as minor, interchangeable. Outside suppliers, IBM's story stands today as one of the single most genuinely instructive case studies in the entire history of American technology. about exactly how thoroughly even the most dominant possible market position can unravel once a company optimizes for winning today's specific product launch rather than protecting tomorrow's entire competitive landscape, a lesson written permanently into the very name of the product category IBM itself invented, and then, through its own hand, ultimately lost.